In 1099, after the First Crusade launched by Pope Urban II, the Christians returned to Jerusalem. Occidental pilgrims gather on the Mount of Olives or climb the slopes of Golgotha. They all have the deep conviction that by following in the footsteps of Christ, they are already on a path to heaven. The mountain trail that leads to the Holy Land is long and perilous. The pilgrims are hundreds of families of defenseless Christians who walk towards the Holy Sepulchre. They are constantly attacked by pillagers who do not hesitate to kill men and take women and children to sell them as slaves. Rumors of insecurity of the pilgrimage routes reach the west. In 1114, Hugues de Pince, a Champenois knight, decides to go to Jerusalem with 8 companions. He creates a religious militia capable of protecting the pilgrims and, more generally, the Holy Land. This handful of men, who are called the Poor Knights of Christ, are attached to the Sanoans of the Holy Sepulchre, who offer them the remains of their meal in exchange for their protection. Very quickly, this sole mission is no longer satisfying them. These Knights of God go to escort and protect the pilgrims in the most perilous passages, especially in the mountain pass of Judea, where the attacks are the most frequent. In 1120, Hugues de Pince obtains the agreement of the King of Jerusalem to transform this brotherhood into a monastic, independent, and military institution. His goal is to participate more actively in the protection of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and of all the other Latin states of the East. A year after their arrival in the Holy Land, King Baudouin II gives the Temple of Solomon to the Poor Knights of Christ. It is from this moment that they take the name of Templars. Today, an archaeological excavation at the very place where the enclosure of the Temple of Paris was located, and the rediscovery at the National Archives of the interrogation roll of the Templars' trial, we have decided to reopen an investigation on the history of this mysterious order, for which fascination remains still a mystery. 7 centuries after their brutal end in 1307, in the heart of Paris, the Rue du Temple, or the Rue des Blancs Manteaux, evokes the presence of the Templars. Under the Temple Hall, archaeological remains directly linked to the Templar Commandery of Paris have been discovered. Strange knights are trying to dismantle the metal structure. The work on the rehabilitation of the hall has begun. A window of 4,000 square meters will be opened on the history of the mother house of the Templars of France, built in 1152. For a year, a unique archaeological excavation will take place at the same time as the progress of the work. The archaeologists of the EVA study office will have to work under the permanent pressure of the construction machines. Until now buried in the basement of the hall, the remains of the buildings of the enclosure of the Temple of Paris will be studied before being destroyed forever. The objects that the archaeologists will put to the test during this excavation will be the only ones that future generations will have of the Parisian Templars.
So here we are in the Temple Square, which means that today it is a hall of the second half of the 19th century, which is located next to the town hall of the 3rd arrondissement. Initially, in fact, what interests us is that we are in the temple's enclosure, which is, among other things, the enclosure of the temples of the Middle Ages. And so our goal as archaeologists is to intervene before the rehabilitation works that are undertaken here, and which involves in particular the restoration of the structure. In this shot we can see the structures of the temple's enclosure with the church, which is located here, whose chalet is located in the embankment of the excavation, the temple tower, and then all the annex buildings, with probably the cloister here, and this demolished wing, which will be tried to find in the excavation.
When we started the archaeological intervention, we were really in the hall, and then gradually we went down in the archaeological levels, and finally we went back in time. We often say that it is the archives of the earth, and it was really that. We started in the 16th century, we went down to the 60s, and we arrived at the Templars period.
From the beginning of the work, a surprise awaits the archaeologists. They discover a medieval cemetery whose dimensions are unique. Nearly 200 graves await them. The first studies show that this cemetery is directly linked to the Templar Commandery, and that the graves are organized in relation to the cloister and the apse of the Church of St. Mary. However, the archaeologists will only be able to search the part that is accessible to them, the eastern fringe. The rest of the cemetery, continuing to the apse of the church, will keep its secrets. The Order of the Temple offers a spiritual framework. It has many recruits of small and medium nobility. These nobles are often knights and know how to fight. These new brothers of the temple quickly set off on the roads of Jerusalem in sacred battles. The Crusades. The Templars are not only knight monks, they are also engaged by the nobles to protect their property. They keep the money and jewels that are entrusted to them in coffers. They also transport these goods protected by their soldiers. Aware of the danger of these movements, they use a method of money transfer based on the exchange contract, which allows you to deposit or withdraw money against a letter certified by the temple. This specialty will very quickly allow them to increase their influence in the financial field. They gain the confidence of a large number of kings and nobles who entrust their treasures to them, protected in the Templar fortresses. The Templars also draw their strength from a network of commanders that extends throughout the West. These rural exploits produce the edibles that the fortresses of the Holy Land need. The revenues earned through financial, agricultural, and real estate activities allow to finance 2 centuries of crusades.
In the West, we don't fight. Western temple houses are not castles. There is no defense of the roads, no defense of the crossroads, as we sometimes imagined. No, they are peasants, farmers, lords, owners of land, farmers most of the time, managers of commercial or artisanal activities in the cities, etc. In this temple house, you have the agricultural buildings, the lodge of the commander and the brothers, a chapel, a courtyard, sometimes a pond, sometimes a mill. In short, everything you need to manage a large agricultural domain. The house as a living space of the small Templar community, and as a center of exploitation of the domains, especially rural domains. And the commandery administrative unit of base, the unit above being the province, and finally the central government. There are the 3 levels. The temple is probably one of the first manifestations of a search for a spiritual life completely adapted to the secular world. The rule sets the framework of this spiritual life, the obligations, the constraints of life in the commandery, in the house, and the search for salvation. The one who enters the temple enters to make his salvation.
Built in 1176, the Templar Church of the Commandery of Arville is one of the oldest in France. Perfectly restored, it offers a rare testimony of the richness of the Templar architecture. Its boat-shaped frame is a symbol of the many travels between the West and the East. The Templar priests had direct access from their lodges in order to come and gather outside the masses. The Templar crosses and the icons that have adorned this church since the Middle Ages are so many testimonies that bring us closer to the daily life of the Templars. Since the creation of the Order of the Temple in 1129, the Templar influx has been rampant. Throughout the West, donations are very numerous, and the Templars have a network of hundreds of commanderies. The castles are the most imposing Templar buildings and are essentially concentrated in Spain on the front against the Moors. Protected by powerful walls and populated by many brothers, their function was that of a stronghold. The fortress of Tomar in the center of Portugal, with its circular church built on the model of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem, testifies to the Templar power. In Paris, it is in the enclosure of the temple that the King of France keeps the kingdom's treasure. The King of England houses his treasure in New Temple, London. The crown and the archives of the King of Aragon are kept in the Templar fortress of Monson. The Templars also settle in the ports. Maritime exchanges with the Holy Land are essential. The decks of the boats are filled with goods and products coming directly from the commanderies. Cereals, cattle, horses, oils and wines leave Collioure, Marseille or Gien. The Templar ships embark at the same time as the new fighters. To lead the Holy War in the East, the Templars rely on fortresses like the Castle of Montreal, built in 1115. After the surprise of the First Crusade, the Muslim armies organize themselves. The Templars quickly build a dozen strongholds in order to deploy their army throughout the Holy Land, from Jerusalem to Antioch. The battles against the Ayyubids first, then the Mamluks, are not permanent. In 200 years of war, there are only 20 major battles, including the Battle of Hattin, where the army of the Franks and the Templars was practically annihilated. The rest of the time, there are raids and clashes between clans that maintain the permanent tension between the Frank states and the Muslim states.
The Templars form an army of trades. The sources describe well and show well the proper military qualities of these troops. It is the discipline, the coherence of these armies, and it is the fact that they are constantly mobilized, quickly mobilized. They are the first to fight and the last to leave the battlefield, according to a formula that can be found multiple times in the sources of the time. There are foot fights. We have very interesting things about the way to arrange the army in a march where it will be harassed and attacked. We always think of the battle, of the battlefield. We settle in a field and then we go. But there are also all the battles in march, and there have been defeats. There have been many defeats. There have been victories too. There have also been many defeats. In the defeat, of course, there have been quite a few deaths, many prisoners, and then there is the escape. Simply, it is forbidden to flee, and it is a serious mistake as long as the gonfanon, that is, the sign of the temple, the vexillum, the flag of the temple, is raised on the battlefield.
In Paris, the National Archives preciously preserve the most important collection of documents belonging to the knights of the time. 500 rare and precious archives tell the history of the Templars since 1129, date of creation of the order, until its brutal end in 1307. Some unique archives require special attention in order to preserve them in the best possible conditions. Today, Guylaine Brunel, the curator of the National Archives, opens the doors of the restoration workshops. Some of these exceptional pieces will bring to our investigation precious clues that will allow us to better understand the role of the Templars during the 2 centuries during which their power was unparalleled.
We have a letter addressed by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, by the Grand Master of the Temple Order, Thomas Berard, a very important figure from the years of the 12th century, and then by the Grand Master of the Hospitaliers. It's addressed to Louis IX to obtain financial aid for debts that have been made to help the Holy Land. Since the act was given to Acre, which is the capital of the Latin states of the East since the fall of Jerusalem, you have the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who is a refugee in Acre, of course, and then the leaders of the 2 military orders, the Grand Master of the Temple, with the classic jump of the 2 Templars on the same horse, and then the jump of the Hospitallers. The Templars were one of the organizations that advanced money to pay for this military contingent. And so they serve as an intermediary between royalty and the Holy Land, because they are able to obtain loans from Italian merchants or to have their own monetary reserves that allow them to pay for things. But it is very interesting about the financial mechanism, the payment mechanism of the military contingents, of the Crusades. There are still several documents left, and in particular a pontifical bubble from the beginning of the 12th century, which explains that the faithful who will give money and means to the Templars will be punished for their sins. So with the figure of St. Paul and St. Peter on the top of the bubble, while at the bottom we have the name of the Pope, who is inscribed Celestine the Q.
In a few streets of the National Archives, the skeleton of the hall of the Marché du Temps is revealed little by little. Archaeologists have been searching the site for 2 months. The foundations of the buildings of the conventional life of the enclave appear and reveal the organization of the Parisian Commandery located in a rural area outside the enclave of Filippo. Archaeologists will discover the apse of the Church of the Holy Mary of the Temple, a part of the cloister and elements of the Grand Prieur's altar. The wall of the medieval cemetery is also revealed. All these very recognizable building elements allow archaeologists to pinpoint as precisely as possible the disposition of the enclave of the Temple of Paris.
The temple square was divided into 3 zones. Our intervention too, to be able to let the coactivity take place properly. In this zone we came across the roundabout, so we knew about its existence. What you see here are the foundations of this roundabout. From the 19th century, this zone was given to the Templars by the king. They filled the area with drainage ditches, which we found here in part.
Since the 12th century, the enclave of the Temple of Paris is a tax-free place. Very quickly, many merchants come to settle there. This roundabout is built to host the shops in a healthier way. As the months of excavation go on, the researchers go back in time through the archaeological courses.
We found something very nice, which is a hydraulic system with a pressure water network and water distribution inside the enclosure. We had the installation of the system, which was known by the texts, but no remains had ever been found, so this is a first.
The ecclesiastics of the time had access to running water, which is really something very, very rare at that time. And on the other hand, we also think, but for the moment it's just a work hypothesis, but also that the Templars offered to bring water to the Parisians. Since in the topography we find an old street right next to the Rue de la Fontaine au Roi, and it is mentioned that it is the Templars who bring running water, who feed the fountains to the inhabitants of the neighborhood. The contribution of running water, we don't realize it, but it's something that's hard enough. A good clean water like that, it's something that's hard enough to have. or at least in the Middle Ages.
The presence of 6 wells dug after the occupation of the Templars astonishes archaeologists. They search these wells to date them and search the National Archives for elements concerning their manufacture. They discover that their date of construction coincides with a conflict between the Templars and their neighbors, the monks of Saint-Martin-des-Champs, who benefit from the hydraulic network. Water passing through the commandery, the Templars decide to cut off the monks' water, which explains why the monks were forced to dig these wells. Week after week, the teams of archaeologists succeed each other and discover new structures. They will reveal a cave perfectly preserved and directly linked to the Church of St. Mary of the time.
The Church of the Holy Mary of the Temple, of the enclosure of the Temple, therefore of Paris, is built on the model of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. And this is exactly what we found, for example, still in the evasion at Temple Church in London.
The Temple Church is the most famous of the Templar churches in England, even though there are still many Templar churches. Because it is still used every Sunday, we forget that it once belonged to the Templars. The Templars built churches on the model of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem, so that Western believers remember what they did in the East to defend the Christians. The pilgrims who traveled to Jerusalem went there to visit the Holy Sepulchre, the empty tomb where the body of Christ was not there on Easter morning, the day of his resurrection. It was a clear symbol to promote order. This is what we do. We take care of the pilgrims and we defend the Holy Sepulchre. The Temple Church in London has a large number of very well-preserved gizans, but we do not know whose it is. When researchers studied them in detail in 1840, most of the shields had lost their paint and their armor, which were supposed to have identified them. In the years 1840, historians and antiquaries looked into the Gizan to find out about their identities. We have writings that describe who were these influential nobles of the 13th century who were buried there. They were dignitaries and supporters of the order, people like William Marshall the Great, who participated in the Crusades around 1180. He was an ally of Richard the Lionheart, King John and King Henry III. It was a very important and well-known historical figure at the time. As far as we know, none of the tombs of the Templars bear a name or a brand, so we have no idea who they are. We think that the English masters of the order are buried here, but where the bodies are, we don't know. The fact that the ground under our feet is regularly flooded would mean that the bodies would not have been preserved for a very long time. We should therefore not expect to find the graves of Templars under the Gizans.
Over the entire excavation of the temple square, we unearthed more than 600 sepulchres dating from the modern period, and below, in the same location, we found 179 medieval sepulchres. For the period of the Templars, we have to deal with several modes of inhumation. We will have several rites. So the first sepulchres that we were able to unearth were what we call anthropomorphic, that is to say that it is just a pit dug into the ground, but which follows the shape of the body. 90% of the individuals were of male sex, which is consistent with the recruitment that we will have for a religious community made up of men, such as the Templar monks. So we are almost certain to be faced with the monks of the Templar Commandery. In general, and we have specific examples, such as at Temple Church in London, the privileged individuals are rather animated inside the church, while we, during the excavation, had the opportunity to search the cemetery outside the Church of St. Mary of the Temple, so we had access to the population living in the enclosure, but not necessarily the most privileged people. According to their location in the cemetery, and according to the observations that we were able to make on the bones, we clearly saw that the individuals who were inhumated in this part of the cemetery have varied activities, and therefore are the people who make the enclosure live, really, rather than those who are in the upper spheres of the commandery.
We, as archaeologists, have a very prosaic vision of things. We know a little bit of history too, and we don't expect to find the treasure of the Templars or the bûchers. No, it's really not in that spirit that we went there. It's really to understand how they lived, by the objects that can be found, by the buildings, how they are organized, oriented towards each other, and then also in relation to the burials, what were the rites, etc. So for us it was really to understand a little bit how they settled, whether they were really on swamps or not. In short, the whole process of facility and evolution, and then not only on the Templars, but also for the centuries that followed, since we also searched over a long period of time. In terms of ceramic furniture discovered, especially in the cellar and the rejection pit just in Tennant, we found what are called large-scale Parisian pichets of different modules, so of different heights, which are quite classic for the periods of the late 13th and early 14th centuries, and then also small polylobed cups, so these are service vases for drinks. All this set that we found was found in the context of rejection. So precisely we assume that when the hospital workers settle down, they carry out remanagement of the works in the enclosure. And they finally make a clean slate of half of what the Templars had left. And what we found in rejection, so the vessel that we found in rejection, probably belonged to the Templars.
Well, that's not bad.
The excavation began 6 months ago. The discovery of a large number of objects from everyday life belonging to the Templars is exceptional. These testimonies, dating from the 13th and 14th centuries, are in a remarkable state of conservation. They inform archaeologists about the ceramic manufacturing methods of the time, but also about the trends linked to the art of the table in the Parisian Commandery.
Of the 179 sepulchres that we found, almost 20 presented ceramics, for example. So it can give us clues about the ritual at the time of the inhumation. On the other hand, we found very few personal effects. As they are monks, they are not at all inhumated with personal effects. We will not find a knight monk buried with his weapon, not at all. At the level of the inhumation mode, we will have different clues. First, on the way they were inhumated through the furniture that we will find. For example, we can find pins of linen, or on the contrary, belt loops, which will show that the individual was either inhumated in linen or dressed. And then, after all that is around the funerals, we will have elements such as ceramics, which will tell us what was the ritual that accompanied the ceremony. For example, the small pots of incense that we found around certain sepulchres clearly served. We really pierced the ceramics, and we see the traces of fire that the incense left inside the vase, which shows that it served for the ceremony.
On the search, the study of the cemetery continues. The discovery of a grave, located very close to the apse of the Church of St. Mary of the Temple, intrigues archaeologists. The tomb of this Templar, built of ceramic and adorned with numerous incense pots, could only be of a dignitary of the order. How to identify a man with so few elements? The discovery of a bronze loop brings archaeologists a valuable clue about the rank of this man. This loop allows us to imagine that this Templar could have been bathed in clothing with a white coat adorned with a red cross, a symbol of belonging to the Order of the Temple. The proximity of this grave to the apse of the Parisian church brings us back to London. At Temple Church, some tombs have also been built outside the tomb. This privileged situation shows the importance of the deceased. The Templar discovered in the cemetery of the Temple of Paris, could he be a dignitary of the order?
Marion, regarde, je te montre rapidement. Donc ça, c'est la sépulture qu'on a retrouvée en terrain. Et tu vois, la petite boucle était donc là au niveau du bassin. Et ça vaut vraiment le coup de la restaurer parce qu'en plus, elle est placée quand même assez proche de l'abside. Donc, parce que quand on reprend le plan, voilà, tu vois, elle est exactement ici.
As soon as the first steps are taken, Marion Bernard, who restores the loop, reveals the metal protected by a gangue of corrosion. The product she applies reveals that the loop is not only bronze, but that the bronze is golden. The dating will bring confirmation that the man who wore it lived in the enclosure between the 13th and the 14th century. After several hours of meticulous work, the loop reveals details that show the prestige of the object. These new elements take us once again to London. The gazan of an English high dignitary Templar buried in the apse of Temple Church wears a loop very similar to the one discovered during the search for the Parisian enclosure. All this information put together shows that the Parisian Templar received special attention during his burial. Archaeologists may have discovered a dignitary of the enclosure of the Temple of Paris.
We are at the edge of the cemetery. We are really at the eastern end. And we are, in fact, checking the limits of a funerary deposit. Each grave is different, whether it is the position of the skeleton, whether it has been cut or not by other structures, whether it is built or other more recent graves. We are looking for a coffin in the pit or not, if there are traces of constraints, a lintel. For all periods, from modern times to medieval times, there is a questioning and different expectation. Frankly, it is not at all monotonous. Quite the opposite.
This medieval cemetery studied in the heart of Paris and the excavation of all the graves and objects of the Templars thus show the importance of the work of archaeologists. These testimonies on the modes of burial of the Templars are unique. They provide new information for the understanding of the history of the order. Today, Guylaine Brunel is working on the excavation of the Temple Square. Archaeologists have been digging for 10 months now.
Merci beaucoup.
This excavation is quite extraordinary because it reveals at the same time all the layout of this part of the enclosure of the temple. So the hydraulic structure, the closure of the cemetery, that we are closer to the daily life of the Templar brothers who lived here and the inhabitants of the enclosure. And then secondly, we still have a very beautiful vision of a medieval and modern cemetery. which is still very rare in Paris, with several dozens and dozens of tombs with different burial methods.
Avec des modes de sépulture différents.
And then the different forms of tombs, tombs made of hard material for a few characters.
Quelques personnages. Donc là, il y a
So there is a multitude of data to interpret, but we immediately see that it is a very rich site. And the cemeteries still have a moving side because we suddenly have in front of our eyes a population, generations of populations who lived in medieval Paris. And so it's true that right away the historian imagines the life of these characters. We have them in front of us. It's still a shock, I think, for a living person to see these generations going back to the 12th century facing themselves.
The cemetery of the enclosure of the Temple of Paris is unique. The skeletons of his Templar brothers, who disappeared 700 years ago, resurface from the past like ghosts of history. They are the treasures of archaeologists and historians. In a year of digging, and this on 4,000 square meters, very few objects of everyday life have been found. Some coins, Philippe II and Philippe le Bel, clearly belong to the period as of yesterday. From the Church of the Holy Mary of the Temple, destroyed by the French Revolution, only a chapel and a gargoyle survive. These are the last remains of this church, once as majestic as the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. For nearly 2 years, Elodie Vermouth, the anthropologist of the excavation of the Temple of Paris, studies the skeletons of all the Templars discovered on the ground. Her work has highlighted precious data.
The population of the Templar cemetery, of the Temple Square, is a case of school, is really the illustration of an ecclesial cemetery, since we are dealing with a preferential recruitment of men of all ages. We have young, mature, aged individuals, so there is no preference. We found that they lived rather in a favorable living environment, since they have no sequelae or any trauma due to a rather rough life. On the other hand, we noticed that they preferred to live in a more peaceful environment. They practiced diversified activities. So they are rather versatile people, so we will not be able to distinguish a banker from a knight, a monk or a squire, but in any case, it gives us an overview of the health of the population. When we dig a grave, it is always fantastic to discover a new individual. We know very well that it is a person. There is always this respect for the person, even when we take it. When we dig, we treat it with regard, but there must be a certain detachment because being in a skeleton state allows this distance with the individual, and it also protects us in a certain way, because we move away a little from morbidity and our own death. Then there are elements that can bring us closer, for example, when we study pathologies. It allows us to give clues about the suffering that the individual may have experienced, and we feel it anyway. We are aware of the pain he must have had. There is also when we find personal effects, where it can be a little disturbing. For example, in the modern cemetery, we could find organic elements such as hair, or we found personal effects such as earlobes, and so it really brings us closer to the individuals. But you still have to keep this detachment to avoid falling into morbidity.
For 2 centuries, the Templars have acquired power and wealth throughout the East and the West. They rule over a real heritage, several hundred agricultural fields, dozens of fortresses and ships. They have also acquired and kept the confidence of the kings and popes who have succeeded them. Their competence in the field of finance is unparalleled. Their army seems invincible. Nothing seems to be able to stop this spiritual, economic, and military rise. Their devotion to Christ gives no limit to their ambitions, because they know that God will absolve them of all the sins they will commit. However, with the loss of Saint-Jean d'Acre on May 28, 1291, it is the very existence of the Order of the Temple that is questioned. How to justify its reason for being now? What to do with such a powerful order but without purpose? For several years, the conflict between the Pope and the King of France on the future of the order has been permanent. In the confusion with Pope Clement V, King Philip the Beautiful decides to organize the arrest of the Knights of the Temple.
The arrest of the Templars by Philippe le Bel is a case that took time to get underway. In fact, for several months the government team had investigated the Templars because there were rumors running about them. Renegades, people who had left the temple, were spreading rumors about secret rites, about inconveniences, about wealth accumulation, about the fact that they did not practice poverty, as was customary for monks. And so these accusations, Nogaret put spies inside the order to find accusations in good and bad shape.
The Templars are arrested on the order of Philip le Bel, in virtue of an order signed in September 1307.
The arrest warrant was prepared on September the 14th. It was sent in secret to all the royal officers of the whole kingdom, and the date had to be kept secret. And on the morning of Friday, October the 13th, all the king's policemen, knights, men on the side locally, surrounded the Templars' headquarters and arrested everyone. The brothers, and then the servants, the milkmaids who were in rural exploitation, for example. And then we made an inventory of everything in the Templars' headquarters, piece by piece, grain by grain, branch by branch, and then the inventory of all the staff of these Templars. Very few Templars escaped this arrest. The Royal Archives cite about 40
The day
names.
after their arrest, the Templars are gathered in the garden of Notre Dame and shown to the people as heretics. This method of propaganda of the arrest of the Templars is set up by Philip le Bel to manipulate public opinion and justify his choice to dissolve the Order of the Temple.
And here is the first preserved interrogation, which takes place in l'Île aux Monts and Troyes, in the Château Cantal, the day after the arrest, since it was on Sunday, October the 15th, 1307. It is ultimately the setting up of the interrogation of the Inquisition, an experimentation of torture and questioning of the prisoners. It is a document in a very solemn form. And here you have only 3 Templars who are interrogated for this great document. Here we have 3 very different Templars, because we have a young man who has just entered the Order of the Temple. And then we have a dignitary, Raoul de Gizy, who was a dignitary Templar who did a lot of receptions in Champagne. We know him because he went to several chapels to receive young people. And above all, this Raoul de Gizy had a financial role with the king, so he was a kind of royal official.
The National Archives keep preciously the manuscript heritage of the history of France. In 2003, Guylaine Brunel rediscovers a unique document of the end of the history of the Templars. He restores this parchment in Latin of 22 meters long, before studying it for 2 years. It is this rare and precious document that he will reveal to us today to give us the keys to the end of the Order of the Temple.
So what I have just carried out is the verbal questioning of the Templars imprisoned in Paris and who were interrogated by the royal police and the Inquisition from October 19th, 1307, so 6 days after the arrest. These interrogations were conducted by the Inquisitor of France, who had delegations of power from the Pope to investigate all the crimes of heresy. So King Philip le Bel asked his inquisitor, who was his confessor, to launch the accusations of heresy and to question the Templars according to these accusations. The Templars, who are the most moving, are those who we know have been tortured in a safe way. And then there are even more moving and above all more resistant are 4 Templars out of the 138 who have not confessed anything. These are tough guys. They said nothing happened, nothing abnormal, and everything they are accused of is false. And we find 2 of them still in prison 3 years later. That is, in fact, they never confessed. These are people who have always resisted. So obviously it is an example, it may be a minority, but it is an extraordinary example. These Templars were arrested following several accusations, especially on the reception modes of the young brothers in the order, which is the fundamental. So they were accused of forcing them to deny Christ at their reception, to spit on the cross, whether it was painted or sculpted, and then to exchange obscene kisses with the one who received them in the order, so on the mouth, on the navel, on the bottom of the back. Also to worship an idol during their general chapter, a statue whose details we do not know. But in any case, they were accused of approaching the devil in a certain way. For most Templars, they were released when they confessed their fault. We think there were about 1,000 Templars arrested throughout the kingdom. And then there were at most 80 or 90 who were on the altar. These are those who were condemned as relapsed because they had first confessed their fault and then they came back on their confession. And so there was a big altar in May of 54 Templars with a few other altars in the province. But of these 80 Templars mounted on the altar, including at the end, Jacques de Molay in 1314. Those who had never confessed their fault, so were considered irreducible, they were not absolved by the church, they did not receive the king's leniency, and they were imprisoned for life in what the Inquisition calls the perpetual wall.
The Council of Vienna is the culmination point of all the investigations carried out by the pontifical commissions against the order. And its role is to decide whether the order of the Temple was guilty, and if so, or if not, what to do. The conclusion was that the Temple was abolished without being condemned. In March 1312, the Pope explained that in the current state of affairs of the investigations, he could not condemn the Temple as heretic, but that the Temple, having been so defamed, by the 5 years of proceedings against him, of course, there was nothing left of it, that it was no longer useful for the Church and that consequently she was abolishing it.
At the age of 71, Jacques de Molay, the last master of the Temple, is sentenced to life in prison. But he disputes this verdict and returns to his allegations. Geoffroy de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, also retired. King Philip le Bel learns of this reversal. Angry, he decides to burn them alive the same evening on the island of La Cité. This bonfire, which will take place on March the 18th, 1314, will definitively put an end to the Order of the Knights of Temple.